When the Night Comes Falling by Howard Blum.
6. Brian, the doctoral student, was the model of ambition. Even before starting classes in the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology at WSU on August 22nd, he had already written to the Pullman, Washington Police Department applying for an internship. Doing his best to sound like an academic in the making, Brian sent an email stating that he had an interest in assisting rural law enforcement agencies with how to better collect and analyze technological data in public safety operations. Which, when translated, meant he had expertise in gathering evidence from surveillance camera videos, checking out the cell phones that had pinged off nearby towers as the crime had gone down, and running relevant license plate numbers through the all-knowing law enforcement computer systems. The application didn't go anywhere. Perhaps the Pullman PD figured even rural cops had a thing or two on a student when it came to putting the technological pieces together in a crime-solving puzzle. Or maybe they were put off by the applicant's know-it-all tone. But for whatever reason, Brian didn't get the internship, which left him time to concentrate on school. There were 13 new students in the doctoral program, and he sought them all out. It was a charm offensive, putting on his newly acquired Hail Fellow persona as he diligently made the rounds and introduced himself. And he clearly enjoyed being this carefully recreated Brian. He had never felt so free, so confident. He had flung off the indignities of his past life. He definitely seemed a little more eager than some of the others to go around and introduce himself. Ben Roberts, a fellow criminal justice grad student, would recall with what seemed like admiration. And as Roberts tells it, Brian would just chatter away nonstop. Sports, music, his rural Pennsylvania roots. Brian, out to win friends, was a master of small talk. While in the classroom, he was a star. He'd plunk himself down front and center, never hiding in the back rows with the trepidatious. He was the student who was always well prepared, who always had his hand raised high, who always had the answer on the tip of his tongue. And when the discussions began, he'd throw himself with gusto right into the mix. Brian always had something to say, and when he spoke, his fellow students listened with attention. An incredibly strong student, Roberts acknowledged. His area of specialization? The criminal mind. In class after class, he made it clear that he wanted to follow in the accomplished footsteps of Dr. Catherine Ramsland. Like his mentor, he would specialize in forensic psychology. It was a discipline, he believed, that could open formidable doors concealing dangerous secrets. Nevertheless, there was one element to the exhilarating show that Brian was putting on in the seminar classrooms that left many of the students with some disturbing misgivings. And it had little to do with what he said. Nor did it really matter how he said it. Rather, it was his targets. When any of the female students spoke up, Brian would go on the attack. He'd rip away at her arguments with a particularly dogged vehemence. A barrage of pointed questions would burst forth. A caustic determination would challenge every assertion. At first, it had simply seemed like rudeness, the brightest kid in the class not wanting to share the spotlight with anyone else. But as the term continued and it became clearer that his combative outbursts were only launched against the women in the seminar, people began to wonder if Brian's taunting was a misogynist's weapon. The golden rule of teaching is that teachers should treat their students as they would like to be treated. But Brian, who in return for his fellowship tuition had to put in time as the teaching assistant for Professor John Snyder's undergraduate criminal law sections, had no time for such a common-sense kindness. Why such disregard? Perhaps he had dreamed about having power for so long that now, when it was an actuality, he was determined to savor it. To hear his bullied students tell it, Brian's arrogance lay deep. His responses to questions about the text or Professor Snyder's lectures were condescending, if not outright mocking, and he enjoyed burying opposing views in a cascade of disdain. And he didn't stop there. When he corrected student papers, his comments scrawled in the margins were insulting, and the grades were scaled to reflect a perfectionist's demands. A higher standard, Brian defiantly called it. It was only a matter of time before the students rose up in revolt. And they had an ally. Professor Snyder had spent 30 years as a lawyer defending criminal underdogs from charges ranging from simple possession to first-degree murder before joining the WSU faculty. He now convened a session where, under his tacit protection, the students vented their feelings about the low grades they had received. Yet Brian, still unbowed, still not recognizing the furor that was brewing, gave as good as, if not better than he got. He was unapologetic. Professor Snyder, by many accounts, kept his thoughts to himself. But behind the scenes, the professor was making it clear that his patience was being tried. Earlier in the term, after the first reports of Brian's high-hatted antics in the classroom had reached him, Snyder had tried to talk some reason into the young man. The professor was a reasonable, avuncular sort, and he was left astonished when the conversation quickly turned into an argument. And so with a lawyer's orderliness, Snyder started to lay a paper trail that could, if necessary, be produced as the road markers to the brewing disaster. He wrote with concern to Professor Melanie Angela Nui, the department head, whose research field was violence and violent death, to inform her that they might have a loose cannon as a TA. Dutifully, she met with Brian on October 3rd to lay down the law. But Professor Snyder was not done. On October 21st, about midway through the term, he sent Brian an exhaustive email enumerating the ways in which you have failed to meet your expectations as a TA thus far in the semester. No doubt Snyder assumed that would shake Brian up. It might even persuade him to behave more respectfully to his young students and the professor for whom he was working. After all, a lot was at stake. Brian wouldn't need to read too closely between the lines to gauge the implicit threat. Lose your TA job, you also lose your scholarship funding. And without the $26,000 or so needed to cover the annual cost of grad school, Brian's matriculation at the university would come to an abrupt end. Brian was summoned to a powwow on November 2nd with Professor Nui and Graduate Director Dale Willits. They started out tough, waving the stick. You'd better shape up or else you're out of here. After that got the TA's attention, they offered the carrot. We can still work this out. They outlined an improvement plan and promised that if Brian adhered to it, all would be forgiven. His academic life could continue. A chagrined Brian grabbed the deal. A month into this truce, as the semester was winding down, a meeting was held to determine if Brian was fulfilling his side of the bargain. On December 7th, Nui, Willits, and Snyder sat in a united force on one side of the long table in Johnson Hall. Brian took his place opposite them. They made Brian sweat, but the verdict was, while not perfect, the professors agreed with a muted enthusiasm, there was progress. And with that, it seemed Brian just had to make it through another 5 days, and then he'd be heading back with his dad to Pennsylvania. His scholarship check for the next semester would be in the mail, and he could return to his TA job in January. But Brian apparently would not rest until he had the last word. For just 2 days later, a self-destructive Brian, responding to an offhanded criticism from Snyder, unleashed the full force of his considerable fury. In an instant, all the progress the TA had made toward a more professional and respectful demeanor turned to sand, and Snyder was fit to be tied. He reached out once again to the department chair, and she sent an email to Brian requesting that they meet. This was, most likely, a summons to the gallows. But before this execution could take place, Brian quite effectively placed the noose around his own neck. Several of his female students reported to the department that Brian was making them feel uncomfortable. In fact, the creepy TA had even followed one of the women to her car. Now there was nothing further to discuss. Brian's TA job was over. Mr. Koberger, I am writing this letter to formally inform you of the termination of your teaching assistantship with the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology effective December 31st, 2022. Yet he never received the notice. By the time the letter was mailed to his apartment in Pullman, Brian had already left campus and was driving back to Pennsylvania with his father. And so, on the morning of December 15th, as the Hyundai continued on its way to the enticing Thai restaurant outside Indianapolis, Brian was avidly explaining to his father that there was no legal way the department would ever be able to strip him of his TA job. Michael had his head craned toward his son, and he was trying, he'd later volunteer, to follow Brian's diatribe as best he could. There were rules for an appeals process, Brian explained. It would be impossible for the department to dismiss him without giving him the chance to have his say. A hearing was necessary, and when he had his day, he was confident that he'd triumph. He had started making an inventory of all the ways he had been wronged, and he wanted his father to know he was determined not to walk off without putting up a fight. The students, he complained, had plotted against him because they were too lazy to do the required coursework. Brian's diatribe suddenly came to an abrupt halt. It was 10:42 in the morning, and as they approached the 107-mile marker on the interstate, Brian saw red and blue lights flashing in his rearview mirror. A sheriff's car was demanding that the Hyundai pull over. Brian obeyed. He sat behind the wheel, waiting as the officer got out of his vehicle and slowly approached. And all at once, every fear Michael had been working to keep out of his thoughts seemed inescapable.